Okay, the next thing I'd like to look at is I'd like to put in some titles. I'd like it to fade in and out, and then I need to get the stuff out. First of all, just doing a transition is very simple. I did one here, the morph cut between the two. So if you want to do a transition between two clips, literally find your transitions, drag it and drop it over the join. And then if you want to fiddle with the parameters of the transition, you select it and it's shown up in the inspector. If you want to get rid of it, select it, delete it. You can actually put a transition on really quickly at any join just by right clicking, and it says, well, add a dissolve of a certain length, like a 50 frame cross dissolve in my 50 frames a second project. We'll put that on. Now I don't want that fade here, but that's how you could do it at any join. I mainly want to fade at the start and the end. So if I go to the start, I want it to fade up from black. Three ways of doing it. One, obviously, drag, cross dissolve, drop. Second, right click and add cross dissolve. You know, the right click puts in a sound one as well. Didn't need it because I put these points in, but it would have achieved the same thing as the points. The other way, which is again something I really like in Resolve, you see a little white handle right up there. Let's zoom in a bit. Right at the start of the clip, little white handle, drag that handle. So I've zoomed in an awful lot. It tells me how many frames I'm doing. I've gone up to 24 frames. That's probably not enough because this is a 50 frames a second timeline. Go to there. Very simple to put in a cross dissolve. There's also one on the sound, so if I wanted the sound to fade in, I can do that. Go to the very end, and again, handle, drag. Sound, drag. You're welcome. To do a title, go to the list of titles in the effects window, and I would grab a title. So you have two types of titles. Ones that say titles and ones that say Fusion titles. Fusion is Resolve's fancy sort of After Effects style compositing program, so it could do fancy titles, and you've got a whole bunch of different pre-made ones here that you can use. Hang over them and it'll just show you what it's doing. A lot of them are animated, a lot of them do fancy stuff, so you could just use one of those by dragging it and dropping it. I'm going to go for a very simple title, which is this. You can choose different types of lower thirds, or you can just choose a blank thing and drop it. I'm going to put the title above the video, and I want to put it over Ringo, so I'm just going to drag it so it's over him. Now you can see the words basic title in there, so if I click on it and I go to the inspector, that's where I can change stuff. So inside of this you've got two tabs, title and settings. Title is for laying out the title, so you would type in his name and then you choose the font you want to put it in. I tend to choose Impact myself. You choose whether you want it aligned left, right, center, and a lot of these things will be pretty obvious. Font size, color, whether it's bold, all that's pretty obvious. And then you've got the position, so let's put this to a more reasonable size. And the position, I'm just going to drag these around and whack it down there. So X is left and right, Y is up and down. You'll notice you can keyframe that, so you can get the words to fly across the screen if you want to. But actually, if I'm animating a title, I tend to use this one, the settings side of it, which transforms the title as opposed to those. Then you can add a stroke, so I can put an edge on it if I want to. Don't like that. I can add a drop shadow, so let's add in a drop shadow and just sort of move it so it's slightly off. And make it a bit more solid and slightly less blurred. I want to go down underneath it, so let's go to -Y. And maybe I want a background as well. So add a bit of height to the background and you'll notice suddenly you get that. And a bit of width. I can add an outline onto it if I want to. And change the transparency. But now I've got Ringo coming up there. If I want it to be a bit further over, I could just use the center to move that and the width to make it a bit smaller. So there we are. I have done a simple title that says Ringo. I want it to fade in. I can come to the front and say add in a cross dissolve there, or I could drag the handles. I now want to do a similar thing for me, so the simplest thing would be to copy it. I could select it, Control C, move along a bit, Control V, and it copies it. Now in most programs, if you do that and then you adjust the second one, it changes the first one. So let's try that. Yes, you can see in Resolve, it doesn't. So you can quite happily copy stuff and then just reuse it without worrying about changing the original. I copied it by doing Control C and Control V. Obviously you can select it and you can come up to Edit and choose Copy and Paste. Or another way of doing stuff in Resolve is to hold down on Alt, drag it, and keep your finger on Alt and then let go, and it puts in another copy. And of course I can come in and change stuff about this. if I want to, but it doesn't have any effect on the other titles. I don't want it twice, so I need to get rid of that. So again, make sure you don't press the delete key, press the backspace key, because otherwise, if I press the delete key, I chop my timeline up. And there we are. Got a couple of titles in, all very simple. I could use some of these other titles, take a horizontal line reveal, put it in there. You'll notice you have these little dots down here, which means it's a Fusion title as opposed to a Resolve title. And if you learnt Fusion, you could do an awful lot of stuff with it. Mainly what you'll do here is you'll click on it, go to the inspector, and you will change the words. So I can see the words are sample offer. Let's change them to David Clarke. And then the word sample underneath, there must be this bit. Let's change that to boss. Let's change the font to impact. And let's change that one to impact as well. And let's see what that does. Oh, it animates in. Let's just chop it down and make it a bit shorter. Now, if I wanted to go further in customizing that, I would actually pop into the Fusion page where you can see you've got all this stuff here, which, yes, it might look confusing at the offset. Like anything, you just sit down and you learn it. I'm not going to go through it now because I don't want to get too confusing. The way of working with nodes and all that kind of thing. You can get used to it and then you can do an amazing amount of stuff with it. You don't need to use it at all, but it's there. Anyway, I'm going to get rid of that and just stick to my regular titles. Now you can see these titles, they need to be rendered. So it's been chugging away in the background, doing that kind of thing whilst I'm talking. And they've gone blue, so they are now rendered. One thing I do with the titles, which you'll see in some of my videos, is I will use a Fusion title, but I use a blank one. And I'll put in some words, which obviously change the typeface, all that kind of thing, set it up nicely. When you're using a Fusion title, this is your basic words, but if you want to do anything else to do with the shading, you've got to come to shading here, and you've got to go through these little numbers. So white solid fill, number 1, is the color of the actual title itself. But if I go to number 2, well, that's the outline. So let's enable the outline, and let's make it not red. And then suddenly I've got an outline. Number 3, oh, that's a shadow. Let's enable the shadow. And then fiddle where the shadow is and the softness and so on. These look different to standard titles because they are different. This is actually fiddling with stuff inside of a Fusion comp. But those pretty easy to understand once you know where to start looking. But the other thing I do here is I like those words to type on screen. So very easy to do that. Use this write on stuff down here. So again, you want to keyframe it. So there's a little dot just like there was with the audio, and I'm going to stick a keyframe at the start and then move the end all the way down there. So the end's at 0. That means there's no words on screen. Move it along a bit and then take that all the way to the end. And what happens is it types those words on at whatever speed you've put in here, where those keyframes are. So on my tutorials, this is how I actually get the words to go www, and the reveal of the W's matches as I'm saying it because I just keyframe this right on effect so the W's are in the right places. Just thought I'd mention that. I'm not actually going to use that in this edit, so I'm going to delete it. So now I've got an edit. Is there anything else to do? Well, I could go through and do a bit of color grading on it, color correction. I've got simple things like it's not straight. Looking at that. Who didn't put the tripod on properly? I need to sort that out. I can sort that out all within this page. So I'm going to select that clip and then I'm going to go up to the inspector. If it isn't open, just click inspector and it pops open. If you can't see the whole thing, you just click on that and you can see the whole thing. And I'm just going to go here to rotation and rotate it until it looks straight. Now, because I've rotated it, obviously got a little black in there, so I'm going to zoom into it a bit. About there, I think. I need to apply that to all of the other variations of me, so I'm going to copy it, select all the other variations of me, right click and say paste attributes. And here I want to change the position, the rotation and the zoom. I want that to be applied to everything. Yeah, that's got them all sorted out. Do the same thing with Ringo. Well, I could try the same settings. Does that work? Let's paste the attributes again. Actually, that worked. I mean, if I didn't like it, I could always readjust it, but I think that worked. So let's do all the other Ringos as well. If I then want to tart up the picture, well, there are video filters to do that. So let's come over to the list of effects. And you can see you've got a whole bunch of filters here, but this is really where you would go into Resolve's color page to do stuff. Now, very simply on this, I would stick the cursor somewhere and click on color. And there you can see each of your individual clips. You can see the whole timeline. What you got to do is come through and adjust it. There is a lot in here. You don't have to know it to make images look good, but there is an awful lot in here and an awful lot you can do with it. To do something simple on here, I would probably just come down to the primary color wheels and I'd go to contrast and I'd up the contrast a bit. Change the pivot one way or the other and it changes how the contrast is applied. I like to drop that down a little bit, maybe up the shadows a bit. If you know scopes, you can click on the scopes and bring them up, and maybe I want to take the lift down a bit, and there you end up with some look that you like. Easiest way to apply that to other clips is just to go to another clip, back to the original, and just click with the middle mouse button whilst you've got your cursor over the original, and it copies the grade from that one to that one. And I'm just going to go through and do that to all of them. You might notice here over the number of the clip, as soon as you've got a grade on it, it changes. So that's got nothing, that's now got a grade. With Ringo, well, I could instead use the curves, maybe, and make the blacks a bit blacker, bring up the midtones. Yep, quite happy with that, and I'm going to put that on all the others as well. And that is sort of thing you're probably used to in other programs, but there is a lot of other things you can do. There's a lot of other ways of fiddling with it. You've got these nodes where you can start layering stuff on it. I don't really want to get into that now because that would get quite complicated. Maybe if everybody likes this video, I'll do something about basic grading. I was trying to avoid using any of these other tabs just because I was trying to keep it simple, but yeah, color, you've really got to go to the color page. But you can go to the color page, come back to the edit page, do stuff, go back to the color page and do it. You can jump backwards and forwards. They're all interconnected, so it doesn't matter. You don't have to do them in any particular order. But there we are. I have now got an edit. Let's just zoom out to see the whole thing. Quick conversation. We say something, some titles pop up, there's a noddy, and then it finishes. Now what I've got to do is get that out. When it comes to exporting, you use the deliver page. It is possible to actually export directly off the timeline, but you don't do that by going File, Export, Timeline, because that gives you ways of exporting the actual edit. Yeah, we used that earlier just to back up a project or back up a timeline. You don't do that. You can do a quick export by going to Quick Export, choosing a pre-made setting and going export. I always go to the deliver page because there's more options, but yeah, that's the quickest way to export. Choose one of these, say choose their YouTube preset if you're going off to YouTube, and export. Asks you where you want to go and it goes and exports it. I personally always use the deliver page, partly because the quick export bits weren't in there when I first used Resolve, but it is pretty simple. So what you have is you have something here which is showing you the timeline, and then it shows you all the individual clips and it shows you where you are on the timeline at the moment. If you had marked an in and out point on the edit page, it comes through to deliver. That actually is something that it didn't used to do. Again, they've changed a lot of things to make it familiar with editors, or you can get rid of in and out points and do the whole thing. Also notice that if I have in and out points set, I can say do the whole thing anyway. But the main thing is up here. It's what are you going to make and where's it going to go? In my tutorial about doing some noise reduction, I did explain when I'm using things like individual clips and so on. But mainly, to keep this simple, I'd say leave it on single clip, choose a setting, click export. You have some presets up here. So these are ones that they would say, oh, well, that's a good one for YouTube and that's a good one for Vimeo. And if you do something like YouTube, you can click this directly upload to YouTube, put some stuff in, put in your account details, which you'd have to put in somewhere else, and it would encode it and then upload it for you without stopping. I'm just going to go for custom and set stuff up. If you're making an edit, you're very probably going to make an MP4 file. So from this list of stuff, you've got all the different types of files it can make. Like when you choose an AVI file, there's some types of AVI files you can do. These are the only codecs you can choose. You can't choose other ones. If you go to QuickTime, again, there's some codecs you can choose, but not too many. And there's lots of still image formats. Still images was the way that Resolve kind of originally worked, because you were going for really uncompressed, high quality images and moving them around, and it worked with still images. AVIs are kind of an afterthought because it was a Mac program and they brought it over to the PC. They do AVIs, but they're more into QuickTimes. But yeah, you're probably going to go for MP4. I would be wary that it does tend to default to QuickTime, so you might do that, H.264, export it, and it would make you a MOV file. Nothing wrong with H.264 MOV files, but most people expect MP4s. So I'd make sure that's on MP4. Next thing is which codec. So obviously you can use H.264 or H.265. H.264 is the most common way of doing it, so I'd stick with that unless you know what the other stuff is. and then more or less I would leave it at all these settings here, because they should match what's on the timeline in the first place. So you can open up any of these things, and you've got lots of different things about color spaces and all that kind of thing. But again, you can cheerfully ignore all that lot. Subtitles, yeah, don't need to do that. If you're doing a long thing, you might want to put little markers on the timeline of a particular color, and then those will become chapter points. Whether people can see those chapter points is another thing, because that depends on what they're playing it with, but it will actually put chapter points in MP4s. On the MP4 side, the one thing I might fiddle with is this, which is to do with the data rate. Now, you'll know if you've made MP4 files in anything else, you can change the data rate of a file. A smaller data rate means a smaller file, but if you put too small a data rate, the picture quality can suffer. What Resolve does in its basic encoder is just gives you these different options: best, high, medium, low, and least. So these will be trying to adjust the quality, which means kind of adjusting the data rate. Nothing here is going to give you a hint as to what the final file size would be, so you just have to guess. Or you can come down to here where it says restrict to, and tick that. That completely grays this thing out, and you can put in a data rate. So it starts off at 80,000, which is 80 megabits. You might want to type in something else, like maybe 15,000. You still don't know what the size is going to be, and you still don't know what the quality is going to be like until you put a figure in. So it'll be a bit of playing around to get ones that you're actually happy with. The encoder that comes with the free version of Resolve is Blackmagic Zone, and it's okay, but there are better ones around. So I wouldn't want to put this too low. Possibly for an HD timeline, 50p, I probably wouldn't go lower than say 20,000. This is just talking head, so it's quite easy. Other MP4 files which are made up of lots of moving stuff and lots of green stuff, which are the kinds of things it doesn't like, you might need to go higher. But mainly you can fiddle with it to try and get a smaller file out of it. You're not going to know how big the file is going to be until you've made it, and you're not going to know how good it looks until you've actually encoded it. So you'd have to try a few of these and see what the results are. The other option would be to make a file which you could then encode with something else. I do use a free program called Handbrake, and to get out to Handbrake on my PC, I'll go to an AVI file and I'll go to a Grass Valley file, and I'll render into a Grass Valley file because Handbrake does understand those, and then I'll be able to encode it with Handbrake, which will probably do a better job for me. But again, that gets a bit more complicated. If you have the studio version Resolve, you have other options here. So I've only got H.264, which is using the software that Blackmagic have written, but you could also use an NVIDIA graphics card. So if you've got an NVIDIA card, a decent one in your machine, you can use that. It will encode things faster and better. You could also use QuickSync if you've got QuickSync available. You can also get a free plugin to use X264, which is the same way that Handbrake does it. You could get that so it appears in the list here. Can't do any of that with the free version, that's all studio only. Amongst all this lot, like I said, all these advanced settings, this is about the only thing that I might fiddle with. Just changing the data rate just to get a small file out of it. Go to the audio, generally leave it as it is, it comes up with good settings there. Then go to File and give it a name. So you can either give it your own name, in which case it says custom name and you can type your own name in here, or you can use the timeline name. If you use the timeline name, it diagonally takes the name of the timeline, which is probably what you want to call it anyway. Where's it going to go? Well, choose somewhere by clicking on Browse. All this stuff here about digits in file name and things, you might use that if you're doing individual clips, because the difference is that will just do the whole thing as one movie. That will save out each clip individually. Most of the time you don't want to do that. You only really want to do that if you're taking it to another program. So like I said, I did explain about that in my noise reduction upscaling tutorial. Most of the time you're going to do that. If you're doing individual clips, then you need to make sure they have different file names, otherwise it might overwrite things. Again, don't really need to understand that for the purposes of just getting used to it. Mainly stay on single clip and either give it a custom name or make it the name of the timeline and then add it to the render queue. So you can make up different settings. Suppose I change this to something else. Let's make a Grass Valley AVI file and add that to the render queue. I've now got two things in the render queue and I can start them rendering. It'll do both of them. I say it will do both of them. If I've got two things in the render queue and I click render, it actually only does one of them because it only does the one that's actually highlighted. So if I actually wanted to do both of them, I'd have to make sure they were both selected and then render. And then it's going to say, well, you've already done one of them because I just did. But now it's going to do one and then do the other. And this render queue actually goes between projects. So if you actually were to start another project, it would leave that stuff in there and you can start it rendering. What you can't do is once it's rendering like this, you can't actually start working in the background. You can't do something else, which you can do with some other programs. You know, like Adobe have got Media Encoder, or ADSX can export stuff in the background. This doesn't export stuff in the background. You have to let it do the render queue and finish it. But that's it. I have now made a clip. In fact, I've made 2 clips. Where is it? Well, I know it's on the D drive, so I could just go to the D drive and find it. There's easier ways of doing that. Just right click on it and say reveal in media storage, and it takes you to the media page and shows you the clip, and you can play it from within Resolve.
Hi. David, I wanted to ask you about AVC HD.
Or go back to the deliver page, right click and say open file location, and it'll pop it up as to where it is. And you can play it in whatever your preferred player program is. And there's my AVI file being in Grass Valley format. So being Windows 11, it wants to play it in film and TV, and it fails miserably because you can't play back Grass Valley AVI files without sticking something else on the machine. But actually, you'll probably just do that. You'll probably just make an MP4 file, which you'll then want to give to somebody. And it really can be as simple as that. That's it. Job done.